Hi, this is Danny Doyle, and welcome to what might be the most divisive tier list I've done yet. Engage is a game that a lot of people have a lot of feelings on, and I have a lot of feelings on Engage as well. If you want to know what my feelings on the cast are, you're in the right place. I'm going to rank them all. I do feel the need to clarify my criteria. I made a whole video about it, which will be linked below. If you haven't already, I would highly encourage you to check that out. But the TLDR is that my primary concern is beating the game. That's it. I don't care about turns, I don't care about time, I don't care about, making sure that characters reach primary endgame builds so that they can go into the, weird tower thing and grind crystal stones with whatever. I don't care about PvP. I think there's a PvP mode. I don't even have Switch Online, so I don't know if there's PvP. I think there's PvP. I know there's, tower trial things, but I don't care about any of that. I just care about beating the game, and if a character can help me beat the game, then I like them. Now, you can beat the game with any of these little fools. Whoever you like, whoever you pick, whoever you want, they can all beat the game for you. But we're still tiering them because some people make it easier than others, And obviously that is subjective, but I believe that all tier lists are subjective, and so I'm fine with that. That being said, I do assume a playthrough where you don't participate in infinite grinding, such as the map spawns and whatnot. Part of this is because I just don't find grinding fun, and so I'm not going to play the game that way, so I'm going to rank the units based on, my playstyle. But part of it is because if you grind everyone up to max level, then everyone just sort of becomes homogenous god killers anyway. The highest difficulty, Maddening mode, actually doesn't allow for grinding, or it does, it has some map spawns, but they're extraordinarily rare, so you're generally not going to be able to do that grinding that you would otherwise. And on that topic, we should talk about difficulty, because while I typically rank on the highest difficulty, and that is what I'm going to do here as well, usually the highest difficulty doesn't have as many mechanical differences as it does in Engage. Typically, the reason that I rank units on the highest difficulty is that they stand out from each other more as the game is harder. When the challenges are easier, basically anyone can just go in the middle of enemies and wipe them all out. But as it gets harder, people's niches and sort of ways that they define each other become more apparent. However, in Engage, there are two changes to the hard mode AI that will affect a couple of fan-favorite characters. Specifically, Louis, Yunaka, and Zelkov to a lesser degree are affected by the AI no longer targeting if they have no ability to deal damage. So if they're dealing 0 damage because someone's just a big, hunky armor knight, or if they have 0 hit because you put core and fog tiles on Yunaka, that they no longer will attack. They'll just ignore that enemy. Or, not enemy, player unit. I actually really like this change to the AI. I know it's a little controversial, but I always thought it was silly that you could just park someone who took no damage and watch them just kill everyone because the enemy's too stupid to realize, maybe I shouldn't attack into this person I deal no damage to. So I like that adjustment, and there are ways you can get around it. For example, you could try to edge the 5% dodges or whatever, or if there's a chain guard or a chain attack, then you can bait them into attacking for the chain attack using something like Corrin's Pair Up. And you can also use, if you have the DLC, Soren's Emblem to force people to attack a unit they wouldn't otherwise. And, there's ways you can work around it. So it is not hopeless, but it does definitely damper the ability of these units to do those specific builds. If you're going to play on hard mode or normal mode, just know that the stocks of these units will rise a little bit. I do want to say that, I think that specifically Yunaka's stocks don't actually go up that much on hard mode just because of the dodge tank thing, and it's because she's typically not going to be dealing as much damage as someone else might, just, low might, knives, all that fun stuff. Early game, obviously, will be very good. We'll talk about her when we get to her. I'll go more in-depth on that. Because knives are actually quite good in the early game. But I think that people overstate just how much the hard mode AI changes impacts Yunaka, and Louis and Zelkov to an extent. Louis especially, he's never going to see 0 damage in Maddening mode because enemy stats go up so high. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that you can use Soren from the DLC to manipulate the AI, And I feel like that would have been a good segue to talk about how I'm not ranking the DLC. I'm assuming that this is a no DLC playthrough. So I have all of the DLC exclusive characters right here in the DLC tier. I've actually never used any of them, which is part of why I'm doing a no DLC ranking, just because I find the Fel Xenologue to be the opposite of fun. I've stopped on the bridge chapter and I'm never fucking coming back. It's garbage. So I'll probably never use these characters. If you have thoughts about them, then, you know, I'm sorry that I'm not going to be able to agree or disagree. Just assume that I put all of these characters in the tier that you think they belong in, and so we're on the same page for these 5, you know. Just assume that I did that, and then we're cool. Then we're cool, because that means I agree with you. With that in mind, there is one other aspect of the DLC, and that is the various DLC emblems, as well as the trials that gain you experience for playing through the DLC emblems. And I'm assuming that we don't have those either. Like, this is a full no DLC playthrough. Truth be told, I think for most units, this doesn't actually make a huge difference. There are a couple of units who uniquely benefit from DLC rings. Celine really likes Marth access, Veyle really likes Soren access. I talked about the armors and the thieves benefiting from Soren existing to sort of like AI manipulate. And whoever you made your primary carry gets a lot of experience in the early game. So the early game unit stocks go up a little bit. And Chloe in particular tends to be very good at just gulping down experience in the DLC maps and sort of jumping the DLC curve as a result of that. The lack of Celestia also means that Ivy is the only flying mage, so that is impactful to her. Well, I guess Hortensia, but she's not. She's a flying staff bot. Truth be told, however, I don't think that the existence of DLC would actually impact the ranking of the units here by all that much. I don't think anyone would actually shift a tier. Some people might move within tiers, but that's about it. I should also touch upon the well, because while this isn't a feature of the DLC, it is something that got added in later updates, and as a result, it's very possible that some people's playthroughs did not contain the well. You know, my first 2 playthroughs, or first 3 playthroughs actually, were before the Ancient Well got patched in, so I had a lot of familiarity with the game's economy without the well factored in. That being said, I don't see any reason to exclude the well when it comes to ranking units. It is a part of the game, whether you like it or not, and it is a part of the game for everyone. You can choose to do no well runs. I actually prefer no well runs, having done both well and non-well. I prefer the economy in no well. It feels interesting to manage the resources in it much more so than if you're using the well and getting a bunch more money than was initially the case, as well as the SP books, but I do still think that in terms of ranking these characters, the well is something that is important to factor in. That being said, I think that some people over-exaggerate how much the well shifted the meta. It is absolutely true that certain unit stocks go up and down as a result of the Ancient Well existing. However, whenever you say that a unit is bad or subpar or even just like B tier or something, I feel like there's always 1 or 2 people who pop up and suggest spending 8 million SP on skills in order to make them fixed. And I guess this is where I should talk about investment, because every single unit in Engage, I keep calling it Awakening by accident, every single unit in Engage, we're not doing another cut. All the Engage units, aside from Vander, needs some form of investment. And if you want to use Vander long-term, he also needs investment. He's just not a long-term unit. But even the short-term units often need investment. Even Vander does, actually. We'll talk about Vander investment when we get Vander. But yeah, everyone in the cast needs investment. Now, different units need different degrees of investment, and different units are going to pay off more or less for investment. But if you're using a unit on your team, honestly, even in the short term, you're probably investing something in them. Oftentimes it can be something that gets passed on to someone else. You know, if you make a forge for Vander and then you don't use him long term, that forge can still be used by someone else with axe access, right? You can just give it to Pannette. But it is still an investment in that character. Oftentimes in other Fire Emblem tier lists that I've made, I've sort of like penalized people for investment, and I am going to be factoring in if someone is like incredibly investment heavy, but the thing that I'm most concerned about is the payoff. Now, I'm not going to assume that every single unit has 10,000 SP in the early game. I just don't think that's reasonable. But I am going to assume that if you are using a unit, you probably want to give them some amount of your resources. You know, everyone usually ends up with at least one forge. Everyone usually ends up getting sealed into whatever class is ideal for them. Everyone ends up with a ring eventually. Everyone ends up with some SP books to get them skills that they want. It's just a matter of what do you get out of all of that investment? And also, how competitive are those resources? Because there are some resources that you're like, yeah, I'll invest this into this person because no one else wants it. You know, early game knives, who are you giving the early game daggers to if not Yunaka, right? So there is that aspect of it as well. If a unit's investment, quote unquote, is not very high competed over, then, you know, if they're using a ring that no one else really wants, such as your Vantage Wrath Warrior using Leaf, then that's not a huge form of investment, as opposed to if somebody needs Lin or Ike, some of the high value emblems, then that is something that is going to be considered much heavier investment. Now, I mentioned earlier that you can beat the game with basically any group of characters, and I think that that is true for every game in the franchise, but it's especially true for Engage because this cast is really homogeneous. There are definitely qualities that cause some units to stand out from the pack, but by and large, you can kind of exchange units with other similar units who you just like better. You know, if you're not a fan of Citrine, you can use Clanne, and, like, it's not going to be that different. Same goes for things like Lapis and Diamant. I've famously talked about how they're basically the same unit. And even some of the scrubs that we'll talk about that end up in the lower tiers, like, they can fairly easily replicate the better unit's performance. They just need a little bit more work, and the payoff might be a slightly worse version of, like, you know, instead of having Kagestu Wyvern be your hard carry, if you make Alfred Wyvern your hard carry, like, he's going to be a little bit worse, but you're still going to be able to do a lot of the same things with him. He's just going to be, you know, worse at it. That is a bit of an extreme example, but I do think a lot of this cast tends to blend together. The features that make them stand out, like their starting class or their personal skills, are often just, like, much less impactful than things that anyone can do, such as wielding specific emblem rings, going into specific classes, etc., etc. Last note before we cover what the tiers are, I promise, the last thing before we cover it, is bond rings. Now, it is very possible to rig for specific S-rank bond rings. If you haven't already, like, there's plenty of tutorials on YouTube, and you can just search up, like, how to rig S-rank bond ring Engage or something. You'll find 8 million videos showing you how to do it. You just enter the map and exit the map, enter the map and exit the map until you get the S-rank that you want. It is not very, like, time efficient. It takes a lot of time to do it, but it is something that is definitely doable. And there are some units that definitely benefit from specific S-rank wings. Like Claude, for example, gives the bow range +1 if you have his S-rank wing, and that is really good. That's really good, having the extra bow range. Dire Thunder is the one that everyone gives the big money to with Olwyn, but you can also get some good mileage out of things like Big Hurdy Lightning from May. There's a Fireball one, I forget who that's from. I think that's Lilina. And then Giga Excalibur from Nino, which boosts the power of those type moves. There are some that you can use to boost smash weapons. I think that's Deke is the heavy-handed one, but there's some decent bond ring skills. And then, of course, Smelly Wood is is drawback, which can be useful for exactly one map. That being said, all of these, like, big, flashy, not even necessarily flashy, but, like, the S-rank bond rings, they're nice. I'll mention them if there's a unit that, like, particularly well uses them. They're not being factored in. And I also think that they're much less of a big deal than early in the meta we initially thought them to be. You know, I was guilty of it as much as everyone else. I talked up Dire Thunder Citrine, for example. But it turns out that yeah, the bond rings are cool, but the regular rings are generally better bang for your buck, and the people you give the bond rings to, usually those end up being like your filler units because they don't get the giant, flashy, amazing rings. So, long story short, I'm not going to be putting anyone in meta-defining because they are a particularly good user of the Hortensia bond ring. Okay, so now we can finally get to explaining what the tier names mean. S tier is pretty self-explanatory. That's meta-defining. These are the characters that, well, define the meta of Engage. They are typically going to be able to do something that no other character can do, or no other character can do as well as them. For the most part, they have something unique that is unique to them. I can think of at least one exception off the top of my head that definitely goes in meta-defining and could be replicated, I guess, but it's just the freest way of doing that. Great all around are the units who, they're not meta-defining, but they are pretty freaking good. You're probably running some number of them on your team. I wouldn't necessarily call them filler. It's more, you don't have, you got like 12 team slots or 14 team slots, depending. And you don't have 12 units in meta-defining at all times. You don't have 14 units in meta-defining. Like, these are the units who you have on your team if you just want, like, the cream of the crop. You have the cream of the crop, and then you have these people because they're also very, very good. They're pretty creamy. Solid filler / short term are units who either you bring on your team as filler, you know, you've got maybe 1 or 2 slots available, and you decided, I'm going to use, you know, Etie this run or whatever. Not that she goes in here necessarily, but just as an example. I've decided to use Boucheron this run. I've decided to use Kagestu this run, right? Like, someone who you don't normally, they're not your go-to, but there's someone you just want, and you try them out, and they're pretty good. Or someone who does a short-term thing. The big one of this is obviously Vander is an early game short-term unit. But people who show up later and are just sort of utility for a couple of chapters, or people who show up in the mid-game. I think that mid-game short-term units are still valuable. Someone who's like around for 3 or 4 chapters in the mid-game and solidly contributing, and then you just sort of bail on them for someone better. The archetypical like Clanne is who comes to mind for me, who shows up in the Western Isles of EP6, and you just use him for a few maps and then you drop him. Something like that I would still consider to be a short-term unit. And I think that they deserve credit for being particularly good in the short term, even if they don't end up getting dragged along to endgame. People who get dragged along to endgame, but are probably not the best choice for it, would be outclassed but still fine. You're going to feel a little bit of growing pains if you use these units or too many of these units, but it's not, they're not like memes, right? They are still someone who's doing perfectly respectable stuff, either respectable combat or respectable utility. They're just not as good as the people above them. It's kind of hard to define. It's more of a like, yeah, they're fine. They don't stand out, I guess would be the thing. Anyone below them, I feel like stands out for just how bad they are, and anyone above stands out for how good they are. And these people are just sort of like, I'm just here. I'm just hanging out, you know. And then we get, to, so initially this was called memes. However, I decided to rename it Axe Power 5 Copium in response to the fact that anytime you say a unit is bad, even if you just say that they're like, okay, but someone else is better, there's always going to be 1 or 2 people popping up from the woodworks suggesting power 5 for whatever weapon. You know, sword power 5, lance power 5, axe power 5, bow power 5, fist power 5, gun power 5. Those last couple don't actually exist, but you get the idea. These are units who are just really, really bad. Now, you can use really, really bad units, and you can bring really, really bad units to endgame. And honestly, even just calling them really, really bad isn't accurate. Like, they're memes, right? They're definitely suboptimal members of the team, but they can squeeze out contributions. And it's not like older Fire Emblem where it's like, oh, I squeezed out a contribution from Rebecca by dealing 8 damage to a Pegasus. No, this is like squeezing out a contribution, like, this person isn't as reliable at one-rounding the enemy, but, like, maybe they can two-round or something, right? Like, they're still fine if you use them, but they are definitely the lower echelon. And then the F is the Bunet Isolation Zone. I don't actually think Bunet is worse than the people in D tier. D and F should be considered the same tier, but I fucking hate Bunet. I genuinely think he's the worst unit in the game. Not by the amount of, like, actually being a tier difference, but I think it would be funny, so I'm doing it for the funny, because it's funny. We'll talk about him when we get to him, but I think he's genuinely the worst unit in the game. And I don't even think it's particularly close. What is pretty close, however, is the genders of Alear, specifically. I think this might be the game where choosing your avatar's gender has the least impact whatsoever. It doesn't have zero impact. There are a couple of very, very niche cases. The biggest thing is Louis and Chloe's personal skills depend on your genders. Louis wants 2 women, whereas Chloe wants a man and a woman. And so, if you care about Louis, you probably want female Alear just to have another woman there. If you care about Chloe's, then it'll depend on who else you plan on having on your team. If you have a lot of other men on your team, female Alear probably helps with that. And if you have a lot of women, then male Alear probably helps with that. And then male Alear is negatively impacted by the personal skills of enemy Rosado and enemy Goldmary, which is present in 2 different maps, the bridge map and the castle map. Neither of those are really big deals, though. Like, I don't think anything that I've listed actually makes a significant difference. I do think female Alear is ever so slightly better. Just because of all those advantages. To be clear, being able to go Sky Knight is not an advantage. Because of the way that Engage's leveling system works, you don't actually ever want to class change as a tier 1 unit. It actually, like, makes it harder to promote, because it doesn't give you any extra experience gain for being level 1. And you don't lose any for early promoting as well. You want to promote as soon as possible. And so as a result, Sky Knight being female locked just doesn't come up because you're not going to second seal into a tier 1 class, like, just ever. But yeah, I think that Alear and Alear are, they are literally the same unit, and the minor advantages that female Alear has over male Alear just, like, don't matter. Like, they really don't matter. I'm going to put male Alear in the DLC tier just because they are the same unit. I don't feel like ranking the same unit twice. But know that they are the same unit. And if I call Alear she, it's just because I always use female Alear. And so in my head, Alear is just female. I like the design better, and I use her because I'm female. And there are those very minor advantages as well. As for the other advantages that she offers, she's kind of a utility lord, so second coming of Micaiah. The biggest piece of utility that she offers is her personal skill, Divinely Inspiring, which will boost the attack, like true damage, of adjacent allies by 3. It also reduces damage they take by 1, but that's less of a big deal. I can come up occasionally if she's like your Bonded Shield Center, but if she's your Bonded Shield Center, then they should be taking 0 damage anyway. But yeah, boosting your allies' damage is very good. 3 true damage means that even if someone would be dealing 0, you can make them deal 3 instead. It can also be stacked with things like Brave Weapons to get the boost twice. You can disengage attacks that have multi-hits, such as Marth's and Lynn's, to get the boost. It's a smaller boost because it'll be divided, but it is still multiple times. So like Lynn's engage attack hits you 5 times. It's a +1 boost instead of +3 boost, but it's really +5 because it's +1 over all 5 of those attacks. And so that can be very nice. The flashier form of utility, and the one that the game sort of steers you towards, is she has access to the dragon typings, the dragon bonuses for emblems. I think that these are actually not very good. The game says, like, oh, dragons, the benefit of being a dragon type class is you get better bonuses on emblems. But by and large, most of the bonuses are actually worse. There are a couple of standouts. The biggest one is Marth, which is good for Alear because she's locked to Marth for a few chapters anyway. But Marth, I genuinely think, is actually best on an emblem in terms of like the emblem bonuses. Everyone else, like, you generally get worse versions of a bonus that would be on another class. Corrin, you do get to pick what Dragon Vein you want, and sometimes you might want something other than fire, but I don't think it's worth the trade-off of having your Corrin freeze on someone who doesn't have 3 range. I like having access to either a longbow or a thunder tome with Corrin's freeze ability, just to give you the extra range on that. And the fact that mages can use fire tiles, like mystics can use fire tiles, means that you can use the best Dragon Vein as a mystic and have access to 3 range freeze as a mystic. So like Sage, or I guess it would have to be Sage, or the thing that Pandreo starts as that I can't remember what it's called. It's like High Mystic or whatever. It uses tomes, fists, and stabs. Those would be the 2 best Corrin ones. Byleth, I guess, is also a decent dragon utility because it does give sort of the Omni boost to stats, but typically you want a big boost to a single stat. You can do Covert for extra speed, Cavalry for extra dex, or Backup for extra strength, and you'll get more of that one stat than you would with Dragon for all of them. So those are, I guess, niche scenarios where Dragon could help you, but in general, I don't think Dragon Vein utility, or Dragon bonus utility, is actually the huge thing that Alear offers. It is mostly Divinely Inspiring and Fist access. Now, Fist access means that Alear can go into one of the Chi Adept lines, and until you get Corrin, no one other than Alear, Framme, and Jean has access to fists. Chi Adept bonuses are, Chi Adept Lucina bonuses specifically, are really, really desirable because Bonded Shield Chi Adept is a 100% chance to take 0 damage from the first enemy attack. If you get doubled, you take damage from the second attack, and if there are backup attacks, you take damage from those. But if you can make it so that your units are not getting doubled, or they kill on counterattack in order to prevent the doubling from going through, then Bonded Shield Lucina can make 4 units invincible for a turn. Or for 3 turns, actually. More if you have extra Lucina rank and stay engaged longer, but bare minimum 3 turns. And oftentimes this is enough to get everything you need done on an area of the map, and then you can recharge or whatever. The big deal about Alear specifically is she has a support with every single other character in the game, which stacks with Lucina's other ability that grants avoid based on support levels. So you can make it so that Alear hits the avoid threshold where the enemies won't attack her, because your Bonded Shield person can still take damage, as opposed to the people around the Bonded Shield person take 0 damage when Bonded Shield is active. The enemy will choose not to target her because she has 0 avoid. As it talked about, the AI quirk, they won't attack 0 avoid people, or they have 0 hit. They will attack 0 avoid. They won't attack people who have too high avoid. I got them reversed. But they have 0 hit on Alear. They won't attack Alear. They'll attack the people around Alear. They'll deal no damage because of Bonded Shield, and Alear can be a very good center for that. So between that and Divinely Inspiring and the early game Marth utility, because Marth is locked to Alear for the first couple of maps, and then once you are able to reassign Marth, Alear still has built up more bond with Marth, and will therefore get Mercurius faster, which is nice because Mercurius is sort of your ticket to Experience Town, and Experience is pretty tight in early game Engage. Alear can kind of snowball in that way. And I do think you do want to invest in Alear early. It's kind of like the Seliph thing in FE4, where like, there's a payoff for investing in this unit. With Seliph, it's the ability to seize. With Alear, if you can promote Alear into a flying class by Chapter 11, then you're in a good position because it makes escaping the map much easier. Additionally, you're stuck with Alear the entire game, so you might as well try to train them. And their stats are not terrible as well. Like, it's not like Alear is a standout unit in terms of like bases or growths, but they're not a slouch either. I think it's 45% strength and 65% speed. I might be getting those reversed. But, 45% strength, 65% speed. They do not have very good magic base or growth. 0 base and 20% growth, so you're probably not going to be doing magical Alear stuff. But you can make them a competent physical unit. They're not going to be an all-star, but they're force, so you might as well. And they have a lot of utility they can offer outside of just combat. I think they end up in great all around, specifically for the utility stuff. I'm really low on the dragon bonuses, other than Marth, although early game Marth boss killing is probably your best boss kill in the early game, is dragon bonus Marth. Other than that, though, not super sold on dragon bonuses, but I do think that the utility that Alear offers is quite substantial at multiple points in the game. One last thing to touch on about Alear is from the end of the game, and that is that she becomes an emblem in Chapter 22, or rather at the end of Chapter 22. Now, you do only get the Alear emblem powers for 3 maps. It's the Volcano, the Snow map, the Lumera map, and the final map, so it's 4 maps. But for those 4 maps, if you want to make use of Alear's emblem abilities, which you probably do, there's some pretty good ones, you have to use Alear for them. You sync. She syncs herself and she gets the emblem powers, but so does the other person she syncs with. So you can theoretically just have Alear sync with someone else and then not take advantage of the emblem powers with Alear, but only with the other person. But even then, I think Alear deserves some credit for that. Like, normally I'm not giving credit to, Louis used Lin, therefore he can attack 10 tiles away, right? Like, no, that's Lin doing that, not Louis. But for Alear in particular, the Alear emblem stuff, I do think she deserves a little bit of credit for that. It's just an additional piece of utility that she brings to the table. And now we come to Vander. Vander is the Jagan of Engage, and he's probably one of the worst Jagans in the franchise. He's still a Jagan, and generally it's pretty good to be a Jagan, but there's no denying he's on the lower end of the spectrum. His base stats, which is basically all that matters for a Jagan, they're alright, but they are much closer to, and in some cases worse than, his contemporaries than you would like for a unit who's supposed to be the early game crutch character. The biggest standouts are his movement stat of 6 and his HP stat of 40, which is very bulky. So this, in combination with his pretty decent mixed bulk of 10 defense, 8 resistance, and 8 speed for not getting doubled, means that Vander is one of the few units who can reliably tank multiple rounds of combat against enemy units in the early game. And that's very nice. Especially when you factor in that he has 6 moves, so he can get to areas where multiple enemies are going to attack him. Even more so if you're willing to give him Sigurd, since cavalry bonuses will make that move even more. That being said, reliably tank multiple rounds of combat does not mean invincible. Vander's most natural comparison in terms of like the tanky unit is Louis, especially since Louis joins in Chapter 4 compared to Vander's Chapter 1. And chapters 1, 2, and 3 are all pretty short. Chapter 1 and 2, I think you could just describe as tutorial maps more than actual real chapters. So chapter 3 is the only chapter that feels like a real chapter where you have access to Vander but don't have access to Louis, although Louis is separated from your group in chapter 4. And if we look at their bulk side by side, while Louis does have worse speed with a base of 3 and worse resistance, but there's not too many magical enemies to worry about, he has 6 more defense and 2 more strength than Vander. So he's better offensively and defensively, assuming that they're not doubling. Now, of course, the existence of Louis doesn't mean you can't use Vander, and I think that you could just hashtag use both, even if Louis was just strictly better than Vander, but Vander does have a couple of things going for him. The extra movement if you're not giving Sigurd to either of them, cavalry bonuses if you're deciding which one deserves to get Sigurd, the res to take on mixed groups of enemies, the speed to stop from getting doubled from a couple of enemies, and the fact that he's not going to be taking armor effective damage. means that Vander's going to have some things that he does. Plus, Chapter 3 is a very good showing for Vander. That being said, even aside from the Louis comparison, Vander does face a couple of problems. If he's trying to set up kills rather than one round, his personal skill is very annoying because it can give him a little bit of crit and make it so that he's not reliable at just setting up kills. On the other hand of things, he's pretty unreliable at getting kills if you explicitly want him to get a kill. Both because oftentimes his damage output is not to the point where he can one round, making him like a better Jagan but a worse unit, but also because his accuracy is extraordinarily shaky. Thankfully, he starts out with 500 SP, and it's pretty easy to fix that by purchasing him a compact axe and buying the hit plus skills with his SP, because Vander's not a long-term unit, and so you probably don't care about his SP management beyond those extra hit. There's not many other early game skills that really benefit him. So I figured, just fire away, boost his hit with that, boost his hit with the compact axe. If you want to forge something for him, it's not the worst idea in the world. Not because, you want to leave it on him, but because it's an axe and a lot of people want to go warrior, and I've seen worse decisions. I don't think forging something for him is either necessary or advisable, but it's not going to hurt you super strongly. The biggest thing, I think, however, is buy the compact axe and give him hit plus skills, and that will fix the accuracy problem. It's not really any fixing the crit problem other than just, trying to position him not near Alear, but sometimes you have to. And it does also mean he can't take advantage of Divinely Inspiring, which really hurts. All in all, though, he's a short-term unit. We have a category for short-term units. And I think that his short-termness is not as short just because of how bad a lot of the other early game units are. It's not as short as you might think, right? At least he has bases. I don't know, I like Vander. I was on the Vander slander train for a while, and I do think that there was some amount of overcorrection from myself and others. But I think he's solidly a low B tier unit. I think Vander's still probably the worst non-Gunter Jagan in the series, but he's still a Jagan. So, next up we have Clanne, the first mage of the game, and magic is actually quite strong in Engage. The tomes are... So you've got 4 schools. You've got the Surge school, or Slurge as I like to call it, and that is 1 range locked. It has a little bit of crit on it, and it can never miss. You've got Fire, which is kind of just the general 1-2 range hits, on resistance, it's whatever. Thunder, which is 1-3 range, but incapable of doubling. And Wind, which is the boring, this has low might, but it's effective against flyers thing. There's also really strong magical weapons that physical units or mage knights can make use of. And in particular, if a mage goes Mage Knight and can use, a Forged Levin Sword, that's some of the best damage output you can get without factoring in things like various emblem skill combinations and stuff. Just generic, I'm attacking with a weapon, bam bam, like the old days. Clanne can do that, and that's kind of the path that the game points you down with him. He has an inherent sword proficiency, which means that he more naturally promotes into Mage Knight than he does into Sage. You would have to train him to get stabs and promote him into Sage. And Mage Knight is nice for him. He is meant to be the fast mage, and so it makes sense that he would promote into Mage Knight, because Mage Knight is the fast magical class. It's got Chaos Style, which boosts your AS. One of the best skills, class-based skills, at least, out there. That being said, Clanne's super high speed comes at a real cost. He has an abysmal magic personal growth and personal base. I think his personal base is 1, and he only has a 10% magic growth, meaning that the amount of magic that he has over just a physical unit who has been turned into a mage is not actually that much. If you really want, random Mage Knight, whoever, you can just take, Louis and turn him into a Mage Knight. You can just take... there's arguments for, Chloe being a better Mage Knight than Clanne. because she has a decent magic growth, and can just, like, whip out the Levin sword and hit everyone with it. Additionally, one of Mage Knight's bigger draws is the fact that it can be used as a speed-fixing tool. It has a pretty high speed base and growth relative to other classes, and Chaos Style can help make up the difference if you're, like, a speed tier behind. And Clanne doesn't really need that, because he does, like, the one thing he brings to the table is his really, really high magic growth, or his really high speed growth, not magic growth, the other one. But, like, then if you send him into Sage, he's oftentimes not fast enough or not dealing enough damage. I do think that he is legitimately quite useful in the early game. I like him against early game Armor Knights. In particular, the Armor Knight bosses early on don't take effective damage from the Rapier or any other effective weapon. So if you want to deal with them, you want to hit on resistance. In Chapter 3, he's the only one who can hit on resistance, and so he ends up being probably the best person to take on the boss. And even non-armored bosses, it can be hard to deal physical damage to them, and Clanne can sort of like take on that role of hitting them with magical damage instead. Additionally, if there are covert units on like fort tiles and stuff, using Slurge to get around that because it never misses is definitely a nice niche. And being able to chip away at 3 range with Thunder, well, once you get your first Thunder Tome, which is in the Bridge chapter, Chapter 8, there's some nice early game stuff you can do with mages. But at the end of the day, he's not even the only early game mage you have. I do think he ends up in outclassed but still fine, just because most of the other magical options you have are just gonna end up better than him as a long-term unit. And like, I have sung the praises of early game mage stuff, but if we're being honest, I think that the early game mage stuff is mostly just killing a couple of Armor Knights that can be annoying. And you do have other tools for the non-boss ones, like Marth's Rapier, like purchasable effective weapons, like droppable effective weapons. His early game is fine, but he really wants to be an investment project, and you've got better investment projects. And without investing in him, he just sort of like drops off the face of the earth. Unlike his red counterpart, who is kind of just self-sufficient in her role for a long time. Now, it's not the most glamorous role out there. Her role is that she has fist access and therefore can be a chi adept. She can use B rank staffs without promotion. This means that she can use, heal staffs, mend staffs, etc. But she can also use warp and rescue and rewarp without promotion. And these are quite useful. Like, movement staffs are very, very good. Movement staffs are, even without Micaiah, the fact that your movement staff is just purely based outside of your magic stat means that her stats, by and large, just don't fucking matter. Which is good, because her stats aren't particularly good. Like, if you're trying to do combat Framme stuff, if you want one of the Christmas Cavaliers to be, or one of the Christmas Stewards to be a combat unit, you want Clanne. Like, his combat is actually decent early on, and while it does fall off, like, if you want to hyper-invest in him, magic is one of the harder things to fix, but, like, you can fix him. I can fix you. Framme, on the other hand, is kind of beyond fixing. Fists are not a very good weapon type, or arts are not a very good weapon type in Engage, just because of the hybrid nature of their damage, and her stats just aren't good enough to sustain them. So she's mostly just a staffer, and also I guess you can do the chain guard thing if you want to. But staffing is quite good. I'm a fan of staffing. I'm a fan of healing. I'm a fan of the fact that she can use movement staffs without needing to consume a second seal or a master seal. Specifically, most people would need at least a master seal, and either that or a master seal and a second seal in order to use movement staffs. And she just gets them for free. Because you don't have Corrin until Chapter 15, you can't just be like, I'll send Boucheron into Chi Adept or whatever, right? Like, it's gotta be her, or Jean, or Pandreo, or a promoted unit. Well, I guess Pandreo is a promoted unit, but She can also be your Chi Adept Center for a Lucina Ball strategy, which, as I mentioned with Alear, is quite nice. Now, Framme does not have the universal support that Alear does, but maybe you want your Alear to do something else. Maybe you sent Alear into a flyer, which can be very helpful for the escape map. Maybe you have decided that you want Alear to be a wyvern, like, I guess that is a type of flyer, but maybe you decided you want your Alear to be a cavalier, or a wolf knight, or whatever it is you've decided. You don't want Alear to be the center. Framme's support list is actually not terrible, and as a result, she can kind of be a knockoff version of Alear in terms of centering your Chi Adept Ball. The big thing is staff access, both in the early game and just for free in the mid game. I think she's probably like here. I think that staff access makes her a pretty good filler unit. Maybe she's just... I could put her in outclass, but still fine, but I don't think she's actually outclassed at anything. I think just solid filler. I have her above Vander, and I think that's correct, but bear in mind that because of how homogenous the cast is, I'm not going to put too much effort into making sure that these tiers are exactly ordered exactly how they need to be. I will put people roughly where I believe them to be, but if you're like super upset about like this not being swapped, I'm not super attached to these tiering orders, and so you can swap them in your head if you want. Next up, we have Alfred, the early game Cavalier, generally thought of by the community as fairly underwhelming, at least from what I've seen. I know there's a few vocal defenders. There's a few vocal defenders for every unit, though. I think that it is uncontroversial to say that I don't think Alfred is a particularly good unit. That being said, he does do some actual early game contributions, because he has stats that are functional and he has 5 movement. If you give him Sigurd, which you probably shouldn't, but if you do, then he gets cavalry bonuses on them as well. His stats are, and this is kind of damning him with faint praise, and it also reinforces the point about Vander, actually not that far off from Vander. He has 9 strength compared to Vander's 11. They have the same dex at 10, and he has a more accurate weapon type. He has 2 less speed than Vander at 6, and 2 less defense than Vander at 8. And 3 less resistance, but I think that's less valuable than the other ones. The big thing is he's got 13 less HP, so like he is significantly squishier. And unlike Vander, he can't take, the multiple rounds of combat. There also will be some enemies who double him that don't double Vander, but it's so close. It's 2 points of speed. He is begging for investment. His growths are actually pretty good. It's just that his bases are... they leave a lot to be desired. If you do decide to feed him experience, give him Marth so that he can get Mercurius and start leveling up that way, or give him Micaiah for Great Sacrifice and start leveling him that way, he can be pretty alright as a physical unit. He doesn't really have any standout areas, and to some extent, his growths are boosted by his personal class, so if you want to take him out of the, I think it's called Avenir, the Cavalier equivalent that he has, the Paladin equivalent that he has, he's gonna suffer a little bit for that, which is very unfortunate, because he's already, kind of behind in terms of bases, and then, growth units. This game is just so rough for growth units. It is quite limiting to him that he is dependent, even to a small degree, on the bonuses he gets from his personal class. But I think he ends up... Do I want to put him in Axe Power Copium 5? I don't think so. I think that he ends up very low C tier, because he does actually do some stuff for you early on. He can do, filler combat in the first couple of chapters, and that's nice. And, again, highlighting him to show how... there is a tier difference, right? But to show how much Vander just kind of doesn't stand out from his contemporaries. Okay. He stands out from his fellow axe-wielding contemporaries, because... God damn it. Boucheron. More like Bencheron. I think this is our first copium unit. The big thing that Bencheron offers is he is the first chain attack user. Now, in the early game, you don't already have all your broken builds online, and as a result, you're not going to be one-rounding as consistently as you will later when you have like specific skill combinations, when you have good forges, when you have everyone built up to their sort of like end game builds, right? And so theoretically, at this point in the game, chain attacks should be at their most valuable, because the problem with chain attacks overall is that oftentimes if you have someone in an endgame build, they're one-rounding the people they're fighting anyway, in which case the chain attacks is just kind of nothing. Like, it's damage that doesn't matter, especially because it's like percentage based, right? And so you can't, like, I guess you could do like the hero ball thing, but I'm not a fan of that strategy. And it's not guaranteed to hit, is the other thing. It's like 80% accurate. So you can't rely on it. You can't build someone who's just able to one around with the help of chain attacks. And you probably don't need it in most instances, other than like, there are some boss characters where it is helpful, but in general, I think chain attacks are quite overrated. With the exception of in the early game, you would think, because you don't have those broken builds online, but unfortunately, I mentioned it earlier, them being percentage-based hurts the early game even more, because, like, you're dealing 1 or 2 damage now instead of 3 or 4. The fact that it is 1 extra point of damage or 2 extra points of damage because it rounds down is so bad. Like, so bad. Yeah, get in the copium zone, Bencheron. At the very least, he's probably high in the copium zone because he is available very, very early when you don't have options. And, like, that means he does stuff in chapters 3, 4, 5, and maybe 6 if you're delaying the Jean paralogue for the well, which I know is something people like doing. I like getting Jean early, but if you're delaying the Jean paralogue for the well, he gets free deployment in those chapters, right? That being said, I have spoken to more than one person who thinks that an empty deployment slot is better than Bencheron, because of the potential for, like, his chain attacks preventing emblem refill and stuff, which I don't personally agree with, but the fact that that's even a fucking argument should show you just how bad this unit is. Like, it's depressing. It's really depressing. Less depressing is Etie, although we are going to get flame wars about her versus Alcrest, because for some reason that fucking debate's still going on. Etie is pretty good. She is the early game archer, and early game archers have come a long way since the days of Gordon. She actually cleanly one-rounds all the flyers in Chapter 3 on Maddening, and with Divinely Inspiring, or I think also a Sigurd Ring boosts her attack enough to one-round or a Strength level up, one-round the flyers in Chapter 4. And that's good, because someone's got to shoot down those flyers. They can be quite threatening. In particular, because those 2 chapters also have a lot of terrain that, like, only flyers can cross, and so it can be, it's not the most glamorous job. It's similar to Framme, but someone has to do it. Now, she does also have a nutso strength growth, and so if you so desire, she can be the unit you invest in. I do think that you probably only invest in 1 or 2 early game units, and I think Alear is almost always one of them. But she is not the worst target for that investment. Her big strength means that she can go warrior if you just give her axe access, since she already has bows. And warrior is one of the best classes in the game. Arguably the best physical class in the game is warrior. You could decide to make her into your vantage crit warrior, and, like, are there better candidates for this? Yes, absolutely. Is it something she can do? Yes, absolutely. I think she ends up, as a result of that, probably outclassed but still fine, or solid filler short term. I want to put her in solid filler short term, mostly just for shooting down those flyers and then having a fairly easy route to one of the more powerful builds. She's low B. She's probably going to be the very bottom of B. I am going to put her in outclass, because she is outclassed by another early game unit, a couple of early game units that we will talk about, just in terms of being the investment target. The flyer killing is real, but it is also only 2 maps, and she needs help for one of them. Yeah, I think C is probably where she belongs. C for Celine. So Celine is another mage that you get, and she also kind of has rough magic, but unlike Clanne, instead of the trade-off being like, oh, I'm supposed to be the really, really fast unit, she's a hybrid unit. I mean, Clanne kind of is already. He has that high strength growth for when he's a mage knight, but Celine just, like, has swords and tomes to start out. She's kind of just a dismounted mage knight in her personal class, and you can send her mage knight, but much like Alfred, she does suffer a little bit from reclassing because she gets some amount of her speed and magic from the personal class that she's in. And considering that her growths are just good enough to keep up with Clanne, like they have the same speed growth, and she has I think 5% higher magic growth. Let me double check on that. They have identical magic growths and identical speed growths. Okay, so it's just that she has 5% more strength growth if you want to lean into that hybrid. She's 35% magic, 40% strength, whereas he has 35 in each in his base class. But obviously, you know, if you reclass him, it all gets fucked around. But her personal speed is lower than his personal speed. She's gaining she's gaining some amount from the personal class. I think she ends up as just a slightly worse version of him. Basically, everything I said about him killing armor knights applies to her, with the exception of the fact that she can't kill the Chapter 3 boss, which is the biggest piece of early game utility he has going for him. They are very interchangeable with each other, however. Yeah, they're very interchangeable for each other, with that exception. Someone who isn't really comparable or interchangeable is Louis. Arguably one of the best armor knights in the series. Like, it's between him, Oswin, and Etie, and Etie doesn't really want to go armor knight anyway. I made the comparison to Vander, but I want to highlight it again. Louis has 2 more strength and 6 more defense than the Jagan, and he joins in Chapter 4. Arguably, it's 4.5 because he's far away from the rest of your group, but he's still doing stuff when he's far away from the rest of your group, so I do count it as joining in Chapter 4. Now, in exchange for this, he has an abysmal speed base of 3, so everyone is doubling him, and he has an abysmal resistance of 1, so keep him away from mages. But he can output damage really well, and he can take hits really well. And his defense and strength will keep up. He has a 55% strength growth and an 80% defense growth. Like, this man is going to continue to tank. The problem is that his speed base and speed growth are so low that I think he might be the only unit in the game that I will confidently say his speed is unsalvageable. Speed is the easiest stat to fix out of all of the stats you give detriments in. Speed Plus is cheaper than any of the other stat boosters. Lin exists and has a whole bunch of speed skills like Speed Taker and whatnot. You can forge people lighter weapons, but even with all of these tools available, I think Louis is not only not going to double anything, but he's going to get doubled by most enemies. That being said, that's not the end of the world, because there are plenty of builds that just don't care about your speed stat whatsoever. Crit builds focus on really, really high damage in a single attack with a guaranteed crit for triple instead of double where you were doubling. On the other hand, you can do something memey like go into Halberdier. I wouldn't recommend it. This is a bad class. Don't go Halberdier, but it is a non-speed related option. You can use skills like Momentum to stack big damage in a single attack. You can use Lunar Brace and Brave weapons to, again, do big damage with 2 attacks, but you don't care about your speed because you're using Brave weapons. My point is that being unable to double is not the death sentence that it would be in other games. That being said, the fact that Louis is doubled by basically everything does definitely hurt. While his defense growth is very good, he does still face growth unit problems. And I feel like around the chapter 10, 11-ish mark, his defense is no longer good enough to make up for the fact that he is getting doubled. Oftentimes you'll run into a situation where one of your other units gets hit and not doubled and takes the same amount of damage that Louis takes from 2 attacks. And, like, again, not the end of the world, but it is kind of a convenient off-ramp for Louis, as you will. You can bring him further and invest in one of the not relying on speed builds, but you can also just sort of be like, well, Louis was the true Jagan after all. And, like, look, we have the traditional Jagan in B tier. I think it's only fair to put the unit that some people refer to as Jagan number 2 in B tier as well. I think that calling him Jagan number 2 is an oversimplification, but I do think that using him as that short-term crutch character is not a bad use of his talents. And if that's all you want out of him, you've still gotten quite a lot out of him. And if you want more, you can drag him over the finish line, and you could do worse. Like, you could go diving into the lower tiers. Or you could do better, such as with Chloe, who joins alongside Louis and is the flyer counterpart to his Armor Knight. While he is the most Armor Knight who ever have Armor Knight, she is the most Pegasus Knight to ever have Pegasus Knighted. Well, not exactly. She actually has a respectable 8 strength, although her 35% strength growth means that it's not really going to keep up. But 13 speed is quite good for this point in the game, and 5 defense is quite bad, especially when combined with her 26 HP. She's very, very frail. Exactly what you expect from an early game Pegasus Knight. But you also probably expect an early game Pegasus Knight to be ranked quite highly. And while Engage does not have rescue dropping, there are definitely some benefits that she gets from being a flyer. If you choose to give Sigurd to her, she's the only flyer early on, which means that she can make use of his movement boost unrestricted, which is very nice because you can use momentum to bolster her damage. While strength is not as easy to make up for as speed, I think in the early game, it's kind of reversed because you don't have access to Lin yet, which means that most of your speed boosting tools don't really come until the mid game. Meanwhile, you have Sigurd to boost your strength using momentum. You have access to forges. Well, you will get access to forges shortly after Chloe joins. In Chapter 6, you get access to forges. And using those together in combination with just like picking your targets, Chloe can actually do a decent amount of damage. If you're not giving her Sigurd, Marth is another good option because the Mercurius can allow her to jump the level curve and get to the point where she's actually getting a significant number of levels, meaning that her paltry 35% strength growth isn't holding her back as much as you might think it does. Alternatively, you have exactly enough forge materials to make a Levin sword as your first forge, and Chloe has a decent magic stat. 4 base and 40% growth is not great at base, but it means that she will generally be able to deal more damage using a Levin sword than using physical weapons if you choose to promote and reclass her into either a Mage Knight or a Griffin capable of using Levin swords, and that's a nice place to be. Overall, I think that she's probably worse than Alear, but not by much. She comes with this, like, it's this weird thing of you usually want to invest in her because she is a flyer, and as a result, she ends up sort of jumping the level curve, and as a result of that, she does better rather than any inherent strength of herself. And others can become flyers, they just, get it later and require another seal for it, and I think she's quite good, but it's weird the way in which she is good, because it's not really like a huge inherent quality of herself. She can make up a little bit for the strength detriment with Fairy Tale Folk, which adds 2 true damage, and that's nice when you can pull it off, but it can be a little bit inconvenient to pull off, especially if you went with male Alear. There's just fewer women to use in the early game. You get Etie, you get Celine, you get Framme, you get Yunaka, and that's about it, and positioning people next to each other. Like, it's nice to be able to do, but you don't always have the opportunity to, especially with a flyer who is often off doing her own thing. I'm talking a little bit down on her. I talked a little bit down on Louis as well. I'm talking down on the people who I'm ranking high. But maybe that's because I feel like the good things about Chloe and the good things about Louis are fairly universally accepted at this point. They're fairly they're well known. Flyer early good. Stats early good. Like, these are good traits to have as a unit. A less good trait to have as a unit is being the paralog trainee unit. I put Jean in front of Yunaka because his paralog opens up after chapter 5, meaning that you can recruit him before Yunaka if you so desire. I guess technically it would be like, no, you recruit him on his paralog. So yeah, if you so desire, you can recruit him before Yunaka. He's kind of just Framme number 2. He's in this weird situation where, like, his personal skill and his growths kind of say, like, hey, reclass me. Make me into whatever unit you want. Take advantage of class growths, reclass me. But then the game doesn't give you a second seal until the end of Chapter 8. And that's pretty late to start being able to reclass units. The way that reclassing works... So basically, the way that his personal skill works is it'll double his class growths. So if you want to put him in a class other than his current one, which is Chi Adept Healer, Martial Monk Healer, then you want to reclass him as soon as possible so that he takes advantage of those doubled growths in whatever his new class is. Like, say you want him to be a physical unit, send him into a physical class so he gets the busted strength growth doubled. But you don't have the option to do that. And so you're in this weird situation where, like, either you sandbag him and then you have an under-leveled unit in Chapter 8, or you just say, fuck it, we're just going to train him as a martial monk, which I think is still his best role, because he just becomes Framme again. Like, he has worse support chain than her, but he can still be a center if you want him to. B-rank staves without any sort of investment is still quite nice. And healing in the early game is quite nice. Now, he has less healing in the early game than Framme does. He's worse at being the Chi Adept Center than Framme is. And B-rank staves is basically identical because, like, you're not warping people before you recruit Jean. But he is still noticeably worse than Framme as a result of that. He does have the potential. He's potential man. That's a meme. But I think... do I piss people off and put him above Clanne? I think I do. I think B-rank staves is quite valuable for him. And, like, especially early on, you only have those 2 B-rank staffers. It's nice. I like it. I like B-rank staves. What can I say? I'm a simple girl. Give me a warp staff. Or a thief. Well... She's not really a thief. Like, she is a thief, but she's a combat unit in the thief class. She's not really a utility unit. Yunaka. Yeah, I said that oftentimes you can oversimplify Louis by talking about him as Jagan number 2. You can oversimplify Yunaka and talk about her as Jagan number 3, because she starts in the thief class, which is kind of a promoted class. Like, it's a special class. But unlike other classes... Or, it's not promoted in that, like, it'll limit her experience gain, but it is promoted in that, like, you can't use a Master Seal to get an immediate stat buff when you get to level 10. Now, because it's a special class, and it doesn't get that stat boost on promotion, because it is just like it goes up to 40 thing, it means it has higher stats than most of the Tier 1 classes in areas that are relevant. But it has lower stats than the Tier 2 ones. It's in this weird, frustrating situation. So she feels akin to a promoted unit early on, and you can forge daggers for pretty cheap and pretty effectively, like, buff their output if you choose to invest in forging a dagger. She falls off, though. Like, she falls off so hard. She's quite useful in the early game. She does feel a step above the rest of your units, the chapter that she joins in for a few chapters afterwards, but then Engage starts handing you, like, incredibly powerful units, and you just don't really have room on your team for someone of Yunaka's caliber. I think she ends up here. The Thief class is so rough for her. The Thief class just, like, I don't know why they did the Thief class the way they did. Maybe they just didn't want to make a promoted version of Thief, but they could have just made a Rogue class and have Thief promote into either Wolf Knight or Rogue or something like that. Because Wolf Knight is a dagger class, but no, instead they just, like, completely screwed over Yunaka and Zelkov. It's incredibly tragic. Now, on the surface, Anna and Jeanne appear to be very, very similar characters. They're both magically focused trainees with a focus on reclassing. Jeanne having the skill that lets him hop between classes and benefit from the boosted growths that they offer, whereas Anna is an axe fighter with a very, very, very high magic growth. Often suggested to be changed into either a Sage or Mage Knight, although you can potentially send her Warrior with the Radiant Bow if you want, or Hurricane Axe if you're incredibly paced. But they end up playing very, very differently. Most of Jean's strengths don't actually come from his trainee potential, or the ability to reclass him, but from the fact that just his starting class is a good place to be. And Anna kind of lacks that. Like, her starting class offers you chain attacks, so if you want the Anna experience, which can be quite fun, you do have to use her as a trainee, and I think that she's not very good when you do that. If you choose to reclass her to make her into a Mage/Sage/Mage Knight, then you're spending second seals to do that, and second seals at that point in the game are actually a kind of limited resource, mostly because you have to buy them. And gold is a pretty limited resource at this point. Unless you've been using... Well, you haven't been using the well, because the well only just unlocks with Anna. So you haven't been using the well to boost your gold up a bunch as well. So you can't have gotten lucky to cheat the system. You do have to invest a decent amount of gold to make her into a mage. Now, if you keep her as a fighter and want to promote her to warrior and use Radiant Bow, then it's going to be a lot longer for your payoff, before your magical Radiant Bow payoff, because she's kind of just an underwhelming axe fighter. You can give her, like, Micaiah and spam out Great Sacrifice a couple of levels, which I have heard as sort of a defense for, like, oh, you know, Anna's not actually that hard to grind, or to train up. Just throw Micaiah on her, and you go away. But that's... So, you could throw Micaiah on anyone, and you will get a better return for investment throwing Micaiah on someone like Chloe, throwing Micaiah on someone other than Anna, and getting some levels out of that, because then they can also get levels just doing competent combat, whereas Anna kind of struggles to do that. So I don't think the existence of Micaiah or Mercurius Marth is necessarily an argument that Anna is... It's not an argument in Anna's favor, it's more an argument of, like, training whoever. Now, what is the output for training Anna? Well, you get someone who has really high magic and really high speed, and theoretically, that's holding a lot of weight there, but theoretically can be the best magical bruiser in the game because she has both the high magic and the high speed, which others lack one or the other of. Well, Pandreo has both, but, like, she will eventually eclipse him, but eventually is, again, holding a very big amount of weight there. I think it's internal level 36 is when they tie. Internal level 36 is something that most of your units are hitting, like, on endgame. I don't think Anna is a particularly good unit. I think I'm going to put her in the Axe Power 5 Copium. I promise it's not just Axe Fighters, but I think I've used Anna in multiple playthroughs. I've sent her Bow Knight, I've sent her Mage Knight, I've sent her Sage. I find her incredibly, incredibly, incredibly fun, but I think at the end of the day, she's not particularly good. I'm going to put a stop to the Archer debate and immediately move Alchrist up right next to Etie before we talk about them, because I think that these units are very, very close to each other. I think that the biggest thing both of them offer is the ability to shoot down flyers as a filler unit in specific maps. Alchrist can shoot down flyers in his join map, the map afterwards, and then he can do some filler stuff for a few maps. whereas Etie can shoot down flyers in her join map, the map afterwards, and can do some filler stuff for a few maps afterwards. Whereas Etie's copium, not even necessarily copium, but like her path to victory, right, is to be one of your crit warriors, just a little bit worse at it than others, potentially. Alchrist actually wants to stay in Sniper class. It's not Sniper, it's a unique class who I'm not going to try to pronounce, but it is French Sniper. And that's because he gets Luna out of it, and he needs Luna to make up for the fact that his stats are fucking abysmal. Specifically, his damage output is fucking abysmal. Now, he can actually, because his speed is actually pretty good, he can, with good speed investment, either from Lin or from various speed tools, get to the point where he actually quads enemies reliably with the Brave Bow. And if he's doing that, then he's got like a 80% chance to proc Luna in a round of combat. And if he procs Luna in a round of combat, he's often killing. Not always. Sometimes he needs to Luna and crit. But you can look at it as, instead of an unreliable proc skill, it is a more reliable form of hitting the enemy. Because if you're comparing, I don't know why people like comparing them to each other, but if you're comparing him to Etie, Etie has accuracy problems. A lot of units in this game have accuracy problems. Having an 80% chance to kill the enemy from Luna, or having an 80% chance to kill the enemy from hitting an 80% hit, are both things that I like those odds, especially in a game with Turnwheel. If it's an Iron Man, then it gets a little bit sketchier, but I think in general, if you want to invest and do the Luna crit build or just the Luna Brave Bow build, it's not horrid. The problem is, again, you've got better things to be doing with your deployment slots. I think actually, because Alchrist is doing stuff in more maps than Etie, because I think his sort of filler arc lasts until like 10 or 11 if you're not heavily investing him, I'm going to put him above her. I've now done this enough so you can get a screenshot of either, so if you want to be angry at me, these two units are so close to each other, though. And the thing is that if you're going long-term with them, they don't even want to do the same thing to each other. So I don't know why. Like, the natural comparison is obviously the stuff that they do shooting down flyers. But if the stuff they do shooting down flyers is not what people debate about, it's Warrior versus Luna. I don't get it. It frustrates me. Engage character discussion is a nightmare. Let's talk about Lapis, and that's not an unrelated thing. Lapis is also just, like, fine. She's outclassed by people around her. Alchrist is one of the people around her that outclasses her, although he's not the big one. Lapis, I've made the Lapis Diamant comparison before, and I think it holds true. Their stats are very, very close to each other. She has 1 point of personal strength over him, and in exchange, he has some personal speed over her. Sorry, no, he has some personal defense over her. She has a point of strength and a point of speed, whereas Diamant has a point of dex and a point of defense. They also have a build difference, which is probably the more substantial thing. Diamant has 2 points of personal build and has a better build growth. When we're comparing their strength growths, Diamant has 5% more strength though, so functionally the same. Lapis has 15% more speed growth, so that's an actual distinction. But Diamant has 5% more defense growth and 10% more build growth. If you want to use heavy weapons that hit hard, they're in the same speed tier. Like, they're in the same speed tier functionally. They're just the same unit. They want to do the same thing. They want to go Wyvern and take advantage of the fact that they can use a couple of speed tools to double and one-round people as Wyverns. And they're both fairly decent at that, but it takes a Master Seal and a Second Seal that would probably be better spent on others. The fact that they need both a Master Seal and a Second Seal, because Swordmaster Myrmidon classes are just, like, so bad, is really damning for them. It's a little bit tragic. I think that what we end up with is Lapis. I'm going to rank Diamant at the same time, because they're just the same fucking unit. They're both in C tier. The question is where in C tier. I think Alfred is probably... I think, honestly, they're probably the bottom of C tier. Alfred does a couple of things in the early game that are not great, but, like, do exist. do we care more about, like, he's available in the early game when no one else is. I think he's over Celine. Do we care about available in the early game when others are not? Or a potential long-term unit, but, like, you have better options that join around the same time? I think I prefer the concretely doing things in the early game to theoretically doing more important stuff, but you're missing out on somebody who's even more important that could fill that slot. But yeah, they're just the same unit. Like, I have Lapis above Diamant because she does have an extra point of personal strength and she joins one chapter earlier. And, like, it's like with the Alear versus male Alear thing, right? You can acknowledge that one of them is technically slightly better than the other. One of them is technically slightly better than the other. But they are also just so fucking identical. Use the one that you like. Like, if you fucking hate Lapis and love Diamant, use Diamant then. You're not going to notice a difference. And if you fucking hate Diamant and love Lapis, use Lapis. You're not going to notice a difference. These are the same unit.exe of all time. I know that we kind of leapfrogged Citrine there, but I do think that talking about Diamant after talking about Lapis, we're just going to talk about the same thing. Like, I don't want to repeat myself. This video is going to be long enough without me doing that. So let's talk about Citrine. I really like Citrine. Citrine is the big, this is someone competing over a Master Seal that joined at the same time as Lapis and Diamant. There's also Amber, but Citrine, I think, is the big one. Really, really high magic turns out very good in a game where it's pretty possible to salvage basically any speed-screwed unit. Of note, there is the Dire Thunder build you can do, and doesn't care about her speed because it doubles using Dire Thunder. It's fine. Like, I've done it a few times because I've rigged the bond rings to do it a few times, and it's like, it's serviceable. I appreciated her being able to legitimately do a lot of damage without needing to use an emblem ring in the mid-game and maddening. That being said, like, it is far from the only way to salvage her, and if you are not willing to rig for bond rings, she's still very, very, very useful. And even not, like, as a slow unit, right? Like, she can salvage her speed by going into Mage Knight, by picking up some speed boosting skills from Lynn, by using Lynn if you would like her to, although I don't necessarily think that that is a good use of her time, unless she's going Magical Sniper. Because as it turns out, a really fucking high magic stat, a personal magic stat, transfers really well into using magical weapons, the high might magical weapons, in classes that aren't normally magically inclined. The Radiant Bow is notable as being the magical weapon that cannot be used by a Mage Knight. So, like, Levin Swords are quite good because you can just slap them on a Mage Knight, take advantage of magical unit in a magical class with the Levin Sword. But if you want to use the Radiant Bow, you have to go into a physical class. So you want someone with a really fucking high magic stat like Citrine. Sniper Citrine sounds like a meme, but it is absolutely not. She is capable of one-rounding a surprising number of bosses, even without any sort of, like, stat boosters or level ups. But she will naturally level up from killing bosses. She also has access to Lynn, Radiant Bow, Asterstorm, which is awesome because it means that you can do magical damage with a really high might weapon from halfway across the map. Because if you send her Sniper, suddenly she doubles the range of Lynn's Asterstorm. It's kind of absurd. It is kind of ridiculous. Now, as you might expect from a mage, her bulk is not great, and enemies in Engage are actually very threatening, to the point where even relatively bulky classes like Armor Knight and Paladin are still in danger if they face multiple enemies over the course of an enemy phase. Thankfully, you can enemy phase using a bunch of tools that make it so that your bulk doesn't matter. Bonded Shield and Vantage builds are incredibly powerful, and make it so that you can just enemy phase and not care about the damage that you're taking. And as a bonus, if you send Citrine into Mage Knight, you don't even need a Chi Adept center, you can use a Cavalier center, because the way that Bonded Shield works is you will get 100% proc chance on the people around you if you're a Chi Adept. If you're a Flyer, you get 100% proc chance on the Flyers around you. And if you're a Cavalier, you get a 100% proc chance on the Cavaliers around you. So, Mage Knight is a Cavalier unit. If you have a Cavalier in the center or a Chi Adept in the center, then Citrine can get a 100% chance not to take damage using Bonded Shield. And between the Mage Knight and various speed boosting things, you can get her to the point where bare minimum she's not being doubled. I really, really like Citrine as a unit. I could spend longer gushing about her, but you've probably already watched the actual Lizard video breaking down Citrine in depth, because I'm fairly certain our audience overlaps like 90%, so if you want more information as to why I'm putting her in, I think, top of B tier? Arguably A tier, honestly, actually. Yeah, I think A tier. Watch that video. I basically agree with every point that they make in that video, and I'm not just gonna parrot it. Like, you should watch him. It's good. It's a good video. And Citrine's a good unit. Next up is Amber, who is kind of the physical counterpart to Citrine. Really high strength and speed that seems bad at first, but is actually somewhat salvageable, either by giving him speed boosting skills or by functionally moving into a build that just does not care about his speed. In Amber's case, that build is the Crit Warrior build. And Crit Warriors are arguably the best physical build in the game. There's a couple of other potential options. Lunarbrace Brave is definitely a good one. Wyvern is, you can never go wrong with Wyvern. But Crit Warrior is a nice place to be. Now, you do get some better Crit Warriors later on. But one of the advantages that Amber has, and I didn't really mention this with Citrine, but it is also an advantage that she and any of the early game units, any of the units before IV have, is the ability to get skills from the first 6 emblems before they get taken away. The biggest one for Amber's purposes is Vantage, because it means he can be a Vantage Wrath Warrior sooner than anyone else, because he can become Vantage Wrath Warrior as soon as you get Ike. You don't have to wait for a leaf to come back. Now, Momentum is another very good one if all you care about is high power builds. The Deke Ring is sort of a way to do that with Amber if you want to do like high power, high movement, momentum smash stuff. But without Sigurd, Momentum gets a little bit worse because you can't go like super omega extra damage with it. You just get like 5 extra damage. 5 extra damage is quite nice, and if you're doing a crit build, 5 extra damage is actually 15 extra damage. So it's not terrible, and with the well, you can pretty easily afford both of them. But I think that if you can only, like if your SP books are at the point where you can only get one, which is reasonable because you don't get the well until fairly close to the Chapter 10 cutoff, Vantage is probably the better one. I do appreciate being able to get Vantage Wrath online sooner than any other character. Well, any other character that wants to be doing that. I guess Louis kind of wants to be doing that. I've never tried Warrior Louis, actually. That said, I said this earlier in the video, but I do believe that magic is generally better than physical in this game. And since they are fairly comparable units, just one's physical and one's magical, it breaks my heart, but I do have to put him at the bottom of A, right underneath Citrine, because, like, I love this guy, but at the end of the day, he is just another physical warrior potential. Now, he has the advantages going for him that I described, specifically being able to get skills early on, and the availability lead is nice as well. Like, it's nice to just have someone who hits really, really hard in the mid-game before you get Pannette, Kagestu, and everyone to save your ass. And even afterwards, like, he's nice to have. But, yeah, it's unfortunate, but it is true that he is worse than these guys. It breaks my heart. I'm sorry, Mr. Alpaca. I'm sorry, Greg. This is not a very Greg moment. Now, you might have noticed that we've talked about most of the early game characters, and meta-defining still has 0 entries in it. Well, that's because Jade is actually secretly the best unit in Fire Emblem Engage. No, she's fucking not. Jade's awful. Oh my god, green unit. She is one of the green unit moments of all time. She's like the dumbest green unit AI. I'm not holding it against her, but it is definitely a show of her power. Jade is an incredibly tragic unit. She shows up and she's like, hey, I can be Louis number 2 at a time where Louis is starting to be a little bit disappointing. But also, I'm worse than him. Like, she invested some of her physical bulk into magical bulk, and like, I did praise Vander for having mixed bulk early on, but that's early on. I think being a specialist, especially in the mid-game, is much better than being a generalist. Like, she can stand up to mixed classes of enemies a little bit better than Louis can, but I don't think the res investment she did, even with her personal skill, is enough to make it so she can actually reliably take on groups of mixed enemies. And in exchange, she's also not really able to reliably take on groups of physical-only enemies. And she joins just at the worst possible time. She joins in Chapter 9, which means there's no opportunities for her to naturally build SP in order to grab the early ring skills. You have to spend books on her if you want her to grab early ring skills. It's incredibly tragic. It's incredibly tragic. Okay, it's time to actually start filling out the S tier, because I think Ivy might just be the best combat unit in the game. So she's a flying mage, which is a unique attribute to just her and Hortensia, and Hortensia's combat stats are not particularly good. Her bulk is actually surprisingly decent, although as I've said, bulk doesn't actually super matter because you can enemy phase using Vantage builds. Well, she can't, because she can't get Vantage. But you can enemy phase using bondage shield stuff. She shows up at the same time as Lucina. She actually brings you Lucina. So if you want to take advantage of the bondage shield build, you can do it with a flyer, you can do it with a Chi Adept, and you can just have Ivy be your flying magical carry. It's kind of phenomenal. It does suck that she joins right after you lose the first 6 emblems, because this means that Canter and Momentum are off limits for her until you get Sigurd back in Chapter 18. But she doesn't necessarily need them, and a lot of the other units you're going to be using are also probably missing these 2 skills. Ivy's magic is really good. She has 17 magic at base, and she will gain even more on promotion, just dealing a lot of damage. Her speed is a little bit shaky, 13 base with a 40% growth rate, and she gains 2 on promotion, so it can be rough doubling people. But hey, Lynn shows up. You know what Lynn's really good at? Getting you all of the skills to fix speed. I talked about the ability to fix speed on a bunch of other units. And while Ivy doesn't necessarily have a good build that doesn't care about speed, she does also have access to a lot of ways to boost her speed. Whether that be Speed Taker and attacking generals, whether that be just the Speed Plus skills, pushing her over to thresholds where she needs to be, whether that be copiuming the Dire Thunder Tome. It's just a lot that she can do, and you can get her doubling fairly easily. And if you have her doubling and you have her bondage shielding, then there's not really much she can't do. Just probably the best carry for the second half of the game. And the second half of the game is when you start getting broken builds online, such as with Kagestu. Like with Ivy, Kagetsu's biggest downside, missing out on Vantage, missing out on Momentum, missing out on Canter, all of that sucks. But, he does have one other downside, which is that he's stuck in Swordmaster for 2 maps, because if you don't have the DLC, then you can't reclass him. I guess you could send him Paladin, but you can't reclass him to, like, Wyvern, which is where he usually wants to go. You can't reclass him to, like, Warrior if you want to do physical Kagetsu Warrior. You can't go Hero if you're, for some reason, decide you want him to go Hero. You shouldn't. It's bad. You're really limited in the things that he can reclass to until you get Ike. Once you get Ike, sky's the limit. And holy shit, at that point, you reclass him and suddenly he has actual stats. Swordmaster is a very, very, very bad class. And as a result, Kagetsu's personal bases are incredibly cracked to make up for that. easily S tier. I don't think anyone will be surprised at that. Kagestu was pretty quickly identified as one of the best units in the game. Now, he's gone back and forth in terms of like how I feel about him, whether he was overrated, whether he was underrated, etc., etc. But if you're looking for a physical carry, you really can't do better than Kagestu. He can fill into whatever role you want for him. I personally think the best thing is either Warrior, surprise, surprise, or Wyvern, surprise, surprise. Like, those are just very good classes. It's hard to fail. But, yeah, use Kagestu. Do I need to tell you about Kagestu? Like, you've seen his stats, right? You've seen his personal stats. It's really good. He doesn't even need the Master Seal. Okay. Personal stats can't save you if you need 4 whole levels to be able to reclass into a Moroden class. Zelkov is in a very, very similar situation to Kagestu in that his personal stats are very, very good to make up for very bad class stats. That said, he does need 4 levels to reclass. He can't just, like, contribute a little bit until you get Ike. You need to use him enough to level him up 4 times, and then you can reclass him to something actually functional. Once you do, you can take advantage of really nice base stats. Or you could choose not to reclass him, leave him in the pretty bad Thief class, but turn him into a utility unit whose stats are good enough to sometimes do filler combat. Byleth is a unit you often want covert on. Lyn is a unit that you often want covert on. Lucina, not so much. But those 2 emblems are it's kind of interesting because, like, you want covert Lyn. If you don't have a sniper, Zelkov is basically your best option for that. You potentially want covert Byleth because that's the biggest speed boost. And if you don't have a sniper, Zelkov is your best option for that. You probably aren't deploying... I mean, you could be using Etie as a sniper. You could be using Alcris. And if you're using Alcris, you're probably using him as a sniper. But if you're not using one of those 2, sending someone else... Or Yunaka, I guess, but, like, her stat... She's just worse Zelkov at this point. Sending someone else into a covert class to take advantage of covert bonuses just feels bad. Because Thief bases are so bad, you're kind of just damning them to not be able to do combat if you send them into Thief. And Sniper's not exactly where you want to be either, unless you're doing Radiant Bow Citrine Sniper stuff, in which case, you're probably not using your Sniper for a Byleth dance. Yeah, it's a solid niche that he offers. I'm torn because it feels like he's a filler unit who joins you at the time when you just don't have the deployment slots for filler units. But then he offers you this unique, like, hey, but I can also do covert stuff, and that's actually really nice. The Soul Mark cutting your deployment slots is the biggest thing that works against him. I think if the Soul Mark didn't cut deployment slots, I would absolutely put him, like, here-ish? As it stands, I'm thinking the middle of C tier. Probably, like... Do we put the Thieves next to each other like we did with the Archers? Actually, I kind of like him better than Yunaka. Just because covert bonuses... The real, like, big brain moment is realizing just how much covert bonuses help during the Psalm arc. And having them on a unit who can just, like, do subpar combat, but it's acceptable subpar combat, is really nice. I think either top of C or bottom of B. C tier's getting crowded. I'm gonna put him in B. That's the worst justification ever, but it's my tier list. I'm so torn on him. We'll revisit him potentially after, but I think this is a good place for him. I've come sort of full circle on comparing the Thieves to each other. Meanwhile, we've got Fogato. If we're talking about comparison to the Archers, like, Fogato's just better than both of them, right? He joins on a horse and promotes to be on a horse and have a decent magic stat. And then he can just use the Radiant Bow and do some wacky Radiant Bow stuff. Or you can reclass him into Warrior and do some wacky Radiant Bow stuff. And it's not going to be as good as, like, a trained Anna Radiant Bow, but as it turns out, the thresholds for one-rounding flyers with the Radiant Bow are 7 magic. He can absolutely attain 7 magic. It's not actually that hard for him. I think Fogato's quite solid as a filler unit. I think... Do I put him above Zelkov? He unfortunately doesn't have... Because he's a riff on a bow knight, right? He gets the cavalry bonuses. But can you imagine if he had covert bonuses because he's kind of related to archery? Oh, that would just be the best. But of course, he's on a horse. That would be unfair. I really like Fogato. I think he's quite solid. Whether that be short term, I think he's actually... So he's solid short term. Yeah, I think I have him above Zelkov. He's solid, but he's here because he's short term solid. Like, I don't necessarily think dragging Fogato over the finish line is... It's not impossible, but it's not something that I necessarily want to do. Instead, I'm just like, hey, you know, I'll pull Fogato out, have him do a little bit of Radiant Bow work, and then send him to the bench when I'm done using him. And that's great for him. Get in, you goddamn piece of shit. You fucking god-awful piece of shit garbage. Fuck you. Get in the isolation zone. So, there is genuinely an argument that he's better than Jade. Because his stats as a Great Knight are better than either Louis or Jade would be if you made them a 10-1 Great Knight. But, like, Jade can be a filler unit in Chapter 10 and can sacrifice herself to hold off the ring corrupted in Chapter 11. And, like, Bunet can't do either of those things. Jade is like the Will archetype, where her utility comes from the potential to die and you not care about her dying. Whereas, like, Bunet... I hate Bunet so fucking much. He's so mediocre. I complained about, like, Zelkov being a good filler at a time where you don't have filler slots. Bunet is bad filler at a time where you don't have filler slots. Entering the Solm arc cuts your deployment slots by 3 and hands you, like, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 very good units. After reducing the number of deployment slots that you have. Like, there's no way Bunet's making the cut here. He has nothing fucking going for him. He's so awful. I hate this guy so much. Like I said in the intro, he probably belongs here, but this is personal. I don't know why, but I fucking hate him. Go eat drywall. And now we come to the unit described as Magical Kagestu. And, well, I've said it before, magical is better than physical. I think Pandreo goes here over Kagestu. But it's not just because he's Magical Kagestu. Like, Magical Kagestu is good and all. If you decide to make him into a Sage or Mage Knight, and have him just be a grounded magical hard carry, that's pretty good. I think Mage Knight is probably the way to go if you're going to do that, because Levin Sword moment. But you're missing out on the big potential of Griffin Knight Pandreo. So he can use the Levin Sword still. His magic's going to be a little bit worse than if he were a Mage Knight, but he can still do pretty decent flying combat. But the big thing is that he has inherent staffs. This means that his staff rank is boosted by 1 in specific classes. Normally, Griffin Knights have C rank staffs, meaning they can basically only use healing staffs. But because his is boosted to B rank because of inherent staff proficiency, that means that he can use the movement staffs as a 6-move flyer. This is incredibly valuable. I didn't even mention it with Ivy, but it is a big part of what makes Ivy meta-defining, because even if for some reason you've decided you are not using her as your carry, she's just a 6-move flyer with Warp, Rescue, and Rewarp, and, like, that's still really good. And Pandreo can be that with a second seal. And he still does decent combat. Like, the Levin Sword Griffin is not a meme. It is a real thing, and it can hurt you. It is approaching your location. Yeah, Pandreo is really, really good. Magical Kagestu and /or just a flying 6-move staffer which isn't just, like, I know that obviously flying 6-move Saphirs are useful for when you are pushing the game to its limits, trying to, like, LTC, move everyone to the objective as soon as you can. But it's also useful if you're just, like, playing the game normally. Like, even if you're not trying to LTC, sometimes you just warp someone to deal with a problem. Like, hey, there's a brigand that's going to destroy the village in Chapter 16. I'll just warp someone over there. I'll just fly someone over there. Oh no, I have to deal with the Chapter 22 enemies that are really threatening. I'll just use the freeze staff to freeze them. I'll just use the entrap staffs to bring them over to my really strong unit to kill them. Actually, I think entrap is A. But yeah, flying staff are, the point remains, like, staff are good. Staff are good, flying good, movement staff's good, combat good, magic good, Pandreo good. Timerra bad. Timerra, I think she's above Jade purely on the fact that she starts with Ike equipped. So I haven't really talked at all about units starting with specific emblem rings. It's rarely relevant. It is for Alear because it's multiple chapters and helps build bond rank a bunch, and it's your best boss killer and also the dragon bonuses on Marth. And it is with Celine as well, because she has Warp Ragnarok and she's sort of the tutorial for Warp Ragnarok on that map. But other than that, I think for the most part, people who start with specific emblem rings equipped don't really benefit that much from it. Like, I guess Diamante can use the fire building thing with Roy if you're treating it like a defend map, and Yunaka can get some great sacrifices in and use Torch and stuff because it's a Fog of War map, but they're not a huge deal. Timerra, however, because we're at the very bottom of the barrel, we're scraping at every amount of utility we can get, and having Ike equipped so that you can destroy and also get repositioned faster is good. It's good. It supplements her tankiness as well. Timerra's trying to be a tank in a game where your tankiness doesn't matter, but also she's not particularly good at being a tank. She's, like, it's weird. She's trying to, like, mimic a soldier/armor knight defensive core thing. But she just gets doubled and beat to shit anyway. It's really sad. Even with Ike, her bulk is really tragic. And of course, her offense output is even worse. So she does the Alchrist thing, where she says, I don't deal damage unless I proc my proc skill. But Alchrist attacks from 2 range, which means that if he fails to proc, he doesn't die. He just, like, doesn't kill the enemy. If Alchrist is relying on Luna to kill an enemy, and Luna doesn't proc, it doesn't kill the enemy. If Timerra is relying on Sandstorm to proc and Sandstorm doesn't proc, Timerra fucking dies. Unless you're using a Javelin, you can't do it from 2 range. And then if you're using a Javelin, she probably doesn't kill with a Sandstorm proc. It's not enough damage. It's funny to see a forecast that says 0 times 2 and then watch Timerra kill someone. It's undeniably fucking hilarious when that happens. It doesn't make her a good unit. She's incredibly tragic. Like, the only thing that elevates her over Jade and Bunet is the fact that she can destroy with Ike and more freely get reposition if you want a reposition bot in her join map. Her retainers are a lot better, though. I really, 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 really like Pannette. I made a whole video on Pannette and why I think that Pannette is better at a physical combat role than Kagestu. And talking about, you know, her easily slotting into the crit warrior build and her really, really high strength, making that crit warrior build even better for her. Anyway, I've changed my mind. I think it's incredibly close, but Kagestu can do the Pannette thing basically as well as Pannette can. And also crit warrior isn't the only physical build you can go for. Like Bondage Shield has made it so that Vantage Crit Warrior isn't as big a deal. And again, in comparison to Amber, right? She can't get Vantage until we get Leaf back in Chapter 18. So she's not even doing Vantage Crit Warrior until the late game, whereas, like, he can. He's slightly worse at it. Or not even necessarily worse, but, like, you have to invest a little bit more in him, right? Because they have the same bonkers strength stuff going on. But it's just that Pannette, like, kind of comes for free like that. And she's a berserker in her join map, so you can have her do it from day one, just she's not a warrior crit berserker. Because you can't reclass in their join map, it's really stupid. But yeah, I really like Pannette. I think she's worse than Kagestu. Just sort of like figuring out things like the Lunar Brace build, like the Bonded Shield stuff, the things that you can do aside from just being a crit warrior as a physical unit. Her lack of flexibility, I mean, it's not like she's completely inflexible. You can make her into other builds as well, but she's really a specialist. And I think being a specialist is quite nice. I talked about being a specialist is better than a generalist when it came to Jade. And I think that holds true, but Kagestu is multiple types of specialists. Like, he's not a generalist. He's not, you know, master of none, right? He can be a specialist in several different things. He can choose what to specialist in, and she really can't. Now Merrin is kind of Kagestu number 2. Their stats are actually really comparable, as well as their bases. She joins 2 maps later than him, but functionally they're close to the same, because Kagestu doesn't really get his full power unlocked until you get Ike. Merrin does also trade in some amount of physical capability for the addition to magic, but hey, if you're doing the warrior build, that just means you can use the Radiant Bow in addition to crit warrior stuff. And I think that's a good place for her. You could also send her Wyvern if you want. Like, she could then just really be mini Kagestu, and there's nothing wrong with being mini Kagestu. Or you could leave her in Wolf Knight if you want just a low investment filler unit. And I think she can be a pretty good low investment filler unit. Like, if you really just... I talked about how, like, everyone in this game needs some amount of investment, and I think that's true if you want to go like long term, but I do think if you're using a unit short term, there are units who can function in the short term with no investment. Like Louis and Vander basically don't need any investment in the short term. Louis probably doesn't need any SP books. You give him like a ring if you want to use him short term and maybe get some skills on it. Merrin can be a short-term, just like, hey, I've got a Wolf Knight with decent stats and access to daggers. It's definitely far from the best use for her, but if you're really tight on resources, like, you could just make her a filler unit. And the fact that she can do that and still perform okay, I think speaks volumes. Especially when, like, if you do invest in her, you just get mini Kagestu number 2 chapters later. I think she's noticeably worse than Pannette, because she can't really... Yeah, I think she's noticeably worse than Pannette, but, like, it's not even a huge amount. It's just, like, Pannette stands out in what she's good at. Whereas Merrin, it's harder to pick up. I do like the magical aspect as well, the being able to be like, I'll just throw the Radiant Bow out there as well, is quite nice for her. I think she definitely belongs in S tier, but she's probably like just at the edge of the bottom. We are continuing with filling out the S tier because Hortensia is one of the best, if not the best, staffers in the game. I think people exaggerate to the degree that she is the best staffer in the game, but she is a flying S rank staffer, so that's something unique to her. Only she can fly and use the... I mean, S rank staff doesn't matter, but A rank, specifically like in Trap, is quite nice. She sucks at combat. She really is just a utility unit. But she has big personality, which increases the range of her staff uses for healing staffs. And possibly due to a glitch or oversight, this includes Warp and Rewarp, which means that she has, with Micaiah, 11 range rewarps. That's really fucking good, and that is the main reason why she is the best staffer in the game. Now, Alear can also do this because the dragon bonus for Micaiah is the +1 staff range. But Hortensia is better at it because you need to like have a higher bond rank with Micaiah for Alear to be able to do that. And meanwhile, Hortensia is able to do it for free and also do it while she's flying, whereas Alear has to be in a dragon class for that. So it's still better, but just to note that, like, Alear can replicate a lot of this. Additionally, people make a big deal about World Tree, and World Tree, it's not nothing. For those who aren't aware, it's a deck % chance to not consume a staff usage when you use a staff. On average, I believe it adds 1 use to every warp staff. Again, on average being the key thing there, because it isn't reliable. You can't really plan around it. But it is nice when it procs. It saves you a little bit of money, or for some stabs that are not unlimitedly viable, it can save you a use of something that is a limited resource. It's not necessary. I know that, like, there have been playthroughs where people have reclassed her in and out of her class just to prove that World Tree isn't necessary. I don't think World Tree is a huge deal, but it is worth acknowledging, especially because I do think some people think that's why she's the best staffer, and while it certainly helps, like, I'm not gonna say no to World Tree. I think the big thing is big personality. Big personality on a flyer, so 6 move. When you get her canter, she can sort of, like, weave around. She can position very, very well as a healer. Very good unit. Probably, like, here? Yeah, I like it. I like this as a spot for her. I think Hortensia is a very good utility unit. In a game full of useful utility units, I think Hortensia is probably the best of them. Well, okay. No, because dancers exist. And Seadal is a dancer in a game where, like, a single action on player phase can be so impactful in Engage. With all of the rings and various ring tools that you have to play around with all of the different broken builds and skills that you have to play around with, a Seadal dance giving someone an extra action is probably the most impactful a dance has ever been in Fire Emblem, and ever will be. Like, a Seadal dance on a Micaiah warper represents warping 5 people. A Seadal dance on your boss killer represents killing 2 revival crystals on the bosses. A Seadal dance just on a generic unit. Like, Seadal is so good. Seadal can dance Byleth, and then allow Byleth to do something after doing a goddess dance to also dance Seadal. Arguably best dancer in the series, other than Azura? I wouldn't necessarily go that far. Azura is definitely significantly better because of, like, shelter singing stuff. But Seadal's very, very good. I think he's definitely S tier, despite the fact that his availability is pretty ass. He joins in chapter 15. The question is where in S tier? I think he's worse than Ivy. Probably, like, here. Probably right above Hortensia. The availability is unfortunate, but as you'll notice, like, most of the S-rank units join in the second half of the game, and that's because the early game not only is easier to an extent, but also, like, the way that the experience formula works, a lot of the early game units just, like, are in a really unfortunate position in comparison to the people that they would match up against, right? You know, like, hey, you could train Clanne, but you just get handed Pandreo. Hey, you could train Alfred, but you just get handed Amber and Pannette. You could train Chloe, but you just get handed Rosado, who's not very good. I hate this. I hate how dirty they did my boy, because I did a whole video on him, like, as a character. I love Rosado. Rosado's great. They did him so dirty. He is just not a particularly good unit. He has stats that are almost good enough to do, like, filler stuff. And thankfully, him joining in chapter 16 is actually, it means he dodges the Zelkov allegations, the Bunet allegations of, like, hey, there's no deployment slots available for this filler unit. But he's still not great. Like, inherent Wyvern access is nice, but reclassing in this game is relatively free at this point in time, and his personal bases are bad. Like, there's a reason people do the comparison of, like, just send Goldmary into Wyvern, and her stats are better than his. Is he on Copium? Am I the one on Copium for not putting him in Copium? I think he's better than any of the other people currently on Copium, just because, like, he has stats that exist for some chapters. He can do filler flunky stuff. I think doing filler flunky stuff probably puts him into C. You probably... Okay, so the thing is that you probably don't need him to be filler flunky, but it's possible that as a result of the deployment slots getting cut in Psalm, you don't have as many trained people as you would like going into Chapter 17, Chapter 18, whatnot, and he can, like, fill in the gaps a little bit. I'm definitely grasping at straws. Like, it's not enough to put him into a solid filler unit, because he's not solid filler. Like, he's filler that you're disappointed to use, but sometimes you use disappointing filler. Goldmary... Okay, so Goldmary is an interesting unit to talk about because, like, the biggest thing that Goldmary offers... Well, there's two big things that sort of work in contrast with each other. One is that she has a really, really high defense growth and isn't in an a particularly defensive class. She's in hero. So you can send her into, like, Great Knight or General if you're based. And be like, I'm just going to be a protection tank. I don't like that, as you can probably tell from the way that I've ranked various protection tank classes. But that is something she kind of offers you. I just don't think it's a worthwhile thing she offers you. It's kind of like a poison fruit. The good thing, well, good, maybe. The copium thing is she is 200 SP and experience away from being a dual assist brave hero. Or brave assist dual assist hero. Which, like, it sounds a lot better than it is in practice. It can be nice to have two chain attacks just, like, come out of nowhere from halfway across the map with Dual Assist Plus and Brave Assist. But in reality, the odds of it happening are not high enough to be reliable. And much like I talked about with Boucheron, with Bencheron, it's just like your units at this point in time should not need a backup attack in order to kill most enemies. It can be helpful for chipping down bosses if you don't have a reliable boss killer, but like, you've got reliable boss killers, take your pick. Most of these units have very, very easy paths to just like one-rounding bosses. Especially because, like, so maybe in Chapter 17, before you get Sigurd and Leaf back, but like, once you have Sigurd and Leaf, and you have Erica and Ike, and just so many solutions to the problem. Yeah, I don't think Brave Assist Dual Assist Hero is especially good. Like, it sounds really good on paper. Is Goldmary just worse than Rosado? No, because if you seal her into Wyvern, like, she can do his stuff. Well, he doesn't ask you to give him a second seal in order to be kind of bad filler. I think... I don't want to put her in Copium. I don't want to put her in Copium, but I will put her at the bottom of C tier. I'm just not as high on Dual Assist Brave Assist Hero as I used to be. Lindon. So we're getting units who are now starting to join quite late into the game, I would consider. Lindon joins in Chapter 18, and this is late enough in the game that, like, I would consider this to be shaky availability. That said, Lindon offers you a couple of things. His personal skill tells you to do a crit build, but crit builds on mages are just memes. There's no killer tomes. The only tome that actually has any inherent crit is the Elslurge. And so you would have to go with that. Or you can do, like, Wrath plus Dire Thunder plus Lindon's personal skill, if you want to be very, very funny. And you can't hit 100% crit, but you don't necessarily need to. It's bad, but it's funny. And also it relies on Dire Thunder, but it's funny. The not funny thing that he does is he, much like Pandreo, has inherent staff proficiency. Everything I said about Flying Griffin applies to Lindon. The thing is that Lindon is mostly doing utility here. He's not really doing the combat that Pandreo is. Like, he can do the combat, but it's a lot worse than Pandreo's combat is. I think Lindon is probably here. Like, he's available for such little of the game, and what he's doing is valuable. Flying Staffer with B-rank staffs, quite good, quite appreciated. But at the end of the day, I think it just ends him up in B, though. Like, it's valuable, but it's not A-tier valuable. Saphir shows up as a warrior. She does not give a good first impression. She does the Jade thing, where, like, the enemies around her just beat the shit out of her. It's even worse than Jade, because she dies, like, on turn 1 if you don't use a movement staff to rescue her. Or fly Alear up to talk to her and rescue her. So, like, that's sad. I actually think her combat is surprisingly competent for this point in the game. She's in Warrior already, which, like, that's the place where you want to be. And so she's not really demanding that many resources. She also already has Merciless, which can be nice against bosses. Oh wait, you can't break them. No joke though, it can be good against wyverns. Or not wyverns, corrupted worms, whatever they're called. Like, you use the break staff on them, and then you hit them with Merciless, and that can be nice. It can be nice for, like, finishing off enemies you failed to one-round. The problem is, why did you fail to one-round them? You probably failed to one-round them because you used Saphir. Because while her combat is quite good, and she can do the crit warrior thing, you've got better crit warriors at that point. I think she ends up, like, top of C tier. C tier is pretty crowded, but that feels right for a game as homogenous as Engage. And now we have Morbius. And Morbius is... he has such a bad first impression. Are you sensing a pattern? He's in Royal Knight, arguably the worst class in the game. Worst promoted class in the game. He gets doubled and, like, 1 or 2 rounded by so many enemies on his join map. He has the Flame Lance, which is kind of, like, made for him, and it's a shit weapon, so, like, he feels like a shit unit. The game does this thing where it's like, hey, you should probably use Morbius and Veyle. We'll give you 2 extra deployment slots as, like, incentive to use them. And, I mean, you can. I think his combat's okay. He has inherent staffs, so, like, much like with Lindon, he can just be a flying staffer if you want him to, with warp and rescue and whatnot. I think he just ends up next to Lindon. They end up doing very similar things. Of note, Morbius has, like, decent mixed offenses, and as a result, like, there is the copium of he's the only good arts user. You can have him use arts because he has the stats for arts. And, like, sure, you can. Like, Martial Master, Morbius. Arts are brave, so that's always nice. Throw Erica on him, but, like, throw Erica on whoever and she'll help them kill. Like, Erica's getting the kill there, not Morbius. I think the big thing is that Morbius has stabs. And, like, he joins later than Lindon and does basically the same thing. His combat's probably a little bit better than Lindon's, but I don't even know if that's true. And then Veyle. Veyle is the last unit that we get, and she is sort of the inverse of Alear. She's the magical variant. She is in a dragon class. It's considered a special class, but she's a high enough level that she can reclass into something else if you want. Veyle is one of the units that gets most impacted by DLC, because she has a, like, completely broken build that just involves giving her Sorin. And if you do that, she's just fucking unkillable. As it stands, she is very killable. She's very frail. But she can hit quite hard. She has a very, very high magic base. She's pretty good at killing Sombron if you use the Alear Engage Fists that only take magic into account, don't take physical stuff into account. She also has a magical knife that isn't really that important. I guess if you want to poison people, you can, but I haven't explained the poison mechanics, and I won't because they're not relevant, because it's usually not worthwhile to poison. It just weakens people, lets them take more damage, but like, just one round. Just one round. There's so many broken builds to one round with. I think Veyle's like, fine. I don't really see anyone else occupying her spot, just because it's the same thing with Morbius, right? Where, like, the game says, like, hey, you should use these units, so I'll give you some deployment slots. And, like, sure, yeah, that tracks. I like her less than Morbius, partially because she just, like, is around for less time, and partially because, like, Morbius at least has the staff thing. Do I like her a tier less than Morbius? Probably, like, here. Yeah. That sounds about right. And then obligatory, we're putting Sabi in S. Yeah, that's important. Hang out with Bunet. Let me know what you think about this list. Yeah, let me know what you think about this list. Comment, subscribe, all that fun stuff. If you disagree with these rankings, that's fine. Like I said, the cast is very homogenous, and if anything, an Engage tier list, more often than not, is reflective of someone's playstyle than it is of the actual, like, validity of units. Like, there are some things that are pretty constant. I think the S tier is pretty constant, although you could argue with Hortensia and Merrin, potentially at the very edge of it. I think the F tier is pretty constant. You could argue a couple of people down, I'm sure. But other than that, like, it's mostly just reflective of the user's playstyle. So let me know your playstyle in the comments. Bye-bye.